Hello, welcome to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. And since I haven't been painting any animals for a very long time, I thought of making a tutorial on how to paint these cute little mice in winter. So I have pre-sketched the image of the mice. You can use any reference image available on the internet. And I'm using cold pressed watercolor paper from Canson, 300 grams per square meter, and the size is A6. So to kickstart, I am going to use the wet on wet technique to paint the mice, since I want the fur to look very soft. So in order to achieve that soft appearance, definitely you have to go with the wet on wet technique. So as you can see here, I'm pre-wetting the mice sketch with some clean water. So the first shade that I'm using here is a mix of magenta with a hint of yellow ochre, just to tone down that pinkish tone color. If you don't have a pink shade as in magenta, you can just use crimson or permanent carmine mixed with a little bit ochre, like what I'm doing over here. At the end of the day, we want to arrive at a color that resembles a blush. So this blush shade is going to be painted on its feet, its almost hairless tail, as well as its nose mainly. So in order to paint this small area, I'm using a micro brush, though somehow it has bleed a lot since it's a pre-wet area. So you can just use your clean paper towel to just wipe out all the excess paint if it bleeds too much. Alright, so it's just some light washes or drops of this paint shade onto these areas. And after that, I'm using a clean damp brush to just wash off those blob of paint, because I want it to look much softer in nature and not dark. And over here, I'm just re-wetting the my sketch, because I noticed that somehow the paper has quickly dried up. It happens at times, so just make sure to just re-wet the paper surface if you notice the dryness, because we want to maintain that wet on wet technique. And after that, I'm just dropping in the same paint shade onto the tail and inner ear area. Moving on, I'm mixing burnt sienna with some yellow ochre to arrive at a milder looking brown shade. I'm just dropping that in onto its head areas as well as its body parts. And once again, I'm applying this paint using my micro brush, because my sketch is quite small. So if your my sketch is a bit bigger, as in drawing on a A4 size paper or A5 size, you can go ahead to paint it using a bigger size brush. And if you want a darker shade, go ahead, you can use burnt umber or sapphire. I will be using that color shortly, just that right now I'm using a brighter shade, just painting it randomly here and there, especially on the top part. And as I mentioned earlier, now I am going to drop in some sapphire. You can use burnt umber and mix with a hint of that burnt sienna, just dropping it nearby its facial area and other body parts. So it's all up to you what shade you want the mice to have. If you prefer to paint the entire mice in a very dark shade, then you can just modify your color palette. I just thought of having a mixture of few shades of brown to give it some extra character. So moving on towards its lower body or belly, I'm going to keep it a bit lighter in shade, since if you notice the mice body part, usually the lower body or the belly is mostly consisting of white fur and its pinkish skin. So I'm just dropping in a little bit of sapphire, very light washes of sapphire, so that it doesn't appear completely white. You know, if you add in a little bit of these sapphire washes, it would look more natural on the mice body. So as you paint the mice and you think it needs more adjustments, then repaint the shades that you prefer onto the mice body. I've also make or apply some dots onto the nose area where the whiskers would appear, and right now I'm painting the ears as well. And also extended the sapphire shade in onto its eye, and as I carefully paint the eye with the micro brush, I'm also leaving a white space as in a glare or highlight on its eye area. Alright, time to paint the foreground, and I'm pre-wetting the area below the mice painting because I want it to have that soft appearance. Wet on wet technique is the best way to paint a snowy blanket with soft appearance. And the shade for this is a light gray. I'm mixing some ultramarine with burnt sienna, and you'll arrive at this gray shade. If you have a ready-made gray shade, go ahead, use it. And I'm using a bigger brush to make these light washes of gray paint onto the pre-wet surface, so it look like a shadow area, dark areas onto the snow covered ground. And I'm also using sapphire to paint in some simple looking rocks randomly here and there nearby the mice. And since it's a pre-wet surface, don't panic if the rock painting starts to bleed out a lot. That adds the natural look to the snow blanket, because usually the snow covered rocks or pebbles, they don't look sharp, they have this icy look. So that bleeding, further bleeding of the pigment will help you to achieve that look. Alternatively, if it's a wet paint on a dry surface, then after applying the paint, you can just give it some light washes with a clean damp brush. Now to add on to the vibrancy of the painting, I'm just dropping in a little bit of that yellow ochre with a hint of the burnt sienna here and there, just to create impression of dry foliages from the autumn season. Now moving on to the background, also I am going to use the wet on wet technique, so you can see me pre-wetting the background area with some clean water. And after pre-wetting it, I'm going to paint an impression of large tree trunk. So I'm going to use the yellow ochre mixed with burnt sienna as the main color with some hints of sapphire. Done with the main tree, next I'm going to use a rigger brush to paint in just sapphire alone some slender looking trees or twigs in the background. Now extending the same grey shade that I used on the foreground on the snow blanket towards the background painting as well. As I notice some hard edges or hard lines, I'm just washing off the edges with a clean damp brush so it has a much more softer appearance. You can leave it as it is if you are fine with the hard edge look. I just thought that soft washes would make the snow appear more natural. painting in some impressions of dry foliages onto the tree branches here and there using my micro brush, extending some of that dry foliages painting onto the ground as well. As you can see, the contrasting color adds more character to the painting. And over here I'm just giving those dry foliages some light washes using a damp brush. Since it's a winter scenery, probably that soft look of the foliages creates the icy or mist like appearance as well. So right now I'm making some touch-ups or second layer of painting just to accentuate the look of the mice, and I'm using the Sapphire shade to paint in the corners of the mice ears as well as some of its facial fur. And I'm painting this on a dry surface of the painting. So earlier in the painting process I kick-started with the wet on wet technique, but right now I'm just applying wet paint onto the dry surface simply because there's already a first layer of shade or paint. So I'm afraid if I use a wet on wet technique it might bleed too much and there would be too much of staining onto the mice face. As you can see here, I'm carefully applying using my micro brush some of the fur onto its nose areas, eyes and so on. And after applying this paint, I'm going to carefully or gently give it some light washes using a clean damp brush so that it doesn't appear too deep or sharp. So by doing this I get to control the paint movement so that it doesn't have too much of staining. So at this point of time I needed some more shadow underneath the mice body itself where it's standing. There's definitely going to be a darker area. So I'm applying the same grey paint that I used earlier, but this time I'm using micro brush to apply this paint because I only want that particular area, that small area underneath the mice body, to have this dark area. And after applying the paint I'm just giving it some light washes to soften its hard edges. As for the mice whiskers, I'm going to use the same grey shade that I've mixed earlier, but in a much more lighter consistency. As you can see here, it's not too dark, so that means it contains more water. And I'm using a script brush to paint in these fine lines. So it would be advisable for you to use a script brush to achieve these fine lines. A little touch of that grey shade onto the highlight of the eye just to tone the look of it. Alright, time for some paint spatters, which is the most interesting part in watercolor painting. You can use white gouache or acrylic to make these paint spatters. Mix it in a nice consistency that will be good enough to spatter it with some hard bristle brush. You can use an old toothbrush to achieve these paint spatters just to create that snowfall look. Before I complete this painting, I noticed that the background seemed a bit empty, so I'm just pre-wetting it before I drop in a little bit of ultramarine blue just to fill up those white areas, because as I say, it looks kind of empty, so you want some light impressions of sky, light colored sky during snowfall. So once again you want to do it wet on wet. So after pre-wetting I'm just dropping in the ultramarine shade lightly, a bit here and there, and I feel after filling in these white areas the painting looks more lively. In fact, all those unpainted areas with the ultramarine blue shade automatically creates an impression of more snow blanket in the background. Finishing it off with more impression of snowfall, once again with the white gouache or acrylic paint spatters. There you go, a cute little mice trailing through the woods during a winter snowfall. So how do you like this painting? If you found this video fun and helpful, then do hit the like, share button as well as subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Thank you. I'll see you in another video. Bye.